Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 12 today as we look for a second time at the passage in 12:5 to 12. We'll see how much of it we get through, where David and then Nathan respond to Nathan's little parable about the rich man, the poor man, the ewe lamb, and the traveler. So as I showed last time, we looked at this little passage here. As we go through this unit, we see that the roles of the different characters correspond to the people in our story differently in each of the several verses. So if you haven't seen this, I wanted to draw attention to that so we can see what can feel slippery if we don't have that in our mind. And part of the point is there are three different stages here, four if we include David's. His first reaction here when he doesn't know it's a parable. Nathan's triple reply in Yahweh's voice, first of remembrance of the past of what David did, second of, or what Yahweh did rather, what Yahweh did for David. Then here, what David has done to Uriah and Bathsheba, and now what Yahweh will do back to David in response. And yet we also have this larger perspective that the characters don't have because we know the bigger picture of how this will play out. And that plays into the chart that I also showed last time and the time before of how this is a master metaphor all the way from the conquest to the exile. We won't deal with all those parts now. We'll deal with some of these as we get there, although a couple of these, like the one of Absalom going into David's concubines, is referenced in the prediction that Yahweh will take the wives and give them to David's neighbor. So as we've been looking through the structure, we're now on this side of it, and as I've been noting on the first side, there's a sequence of conversations via messengers between David and Bathsheba, David and Uriah, and David and Joab. Now it's direct speech, although indirect in the sense that Yahweh is speaking through Nathan. So in a way we could say Nathan is the messenger for Yahweh, although we don't hear the language of messengers, although we did hear the language of sending, as you see there. And this will all be through Nathan's mouth coming from Yahweh. And then we'll see David and Yahweh in the next scene, which is about his mourning, and it's not a direct encounter in that same way. As we follow the key words here, we see there's this nice chiasm here from 12:7 to 12, and you can see how it's framed with the question of over Israel or all Israel, the beginning and the end. And then the key issue with the words and the connection of the chiasm, taking your women. So your master's women taking his women to be your woman, and the same thing here. And in the center of the chiasm, now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me. But we start up here with David's response, and so I want to look at it up there, and we'll look at a couple more things as we go. So why don't I just leave this up, and we'll enter into our passage right now. So as my note has just for me, his response to this also brings up his old and probably still there unconscious feelings about Saul, who, quote, deserved to die, which is what he says here. Literally, be a son of death. But to continue that note, but for the fact, as David repeated several times, he was Yahweh's anointed. And the lamb, in that case Michal, was restored to David along with the monarchy itself. None of that's conscious in the text, but I'd like to suggest that that could be part of what's going on with David. As Falkman notes here in characterizing David's response here in verses 5 and 6, the quickness, severity, and intense indignation on David's part all constitute signs of his lack of equilibrium and too great an involvement. And of course, as we've been seeing, the reason this works to evoke David's anger is he believes it's a real story, not a parable. As I've noted in a video 2 videos ago, Nathan just comes right up to him and says this, and there's no preface at all and no context for it within the relationship between David and Nathan. So that's all we know. So David's anger we've seen once before. We'll see it again around the issue of the rape of Tamar. As Graham Auld notes, David's anger is sparked by a report of injury to a person for whom he is responsible in all these situations. We see the verb here, harak, to kindle anger. It's all one word, the verb and the noun, to kindle anger. And we've seen it a few times. I'm not going to make a chart of it all, but you can see that David's anger comes up in a number of places, and other people's anger as well. Jeremy Schipper, whose work I've used last time, notes, suggests that this anger is connected to 11:22, following the Septuagint, when David became angry with Joab, using the same word as here. And that's the idea here, that David understands that Nathan is telling him a story about Joab, that Joab took Uriah, not because David doesn't know that Nathan knows about that David took Bathsheba and had Uriah sent to his death via the note he sent to the note he sent to Joab. So this may well be that David's initial anger is against Joab, is the one he thinks Nathan's talking about, even though David knows it was his own idea, not Joab's idea. That would be David playing along with what Nathan has. So in that case, the anger is perhaps feigned as well, but it's hard to tell. We've seen David feign emotions before when he was with the Philistines, and he had his saliva drool down his mouth that he scratched at the door to feign madness. So we know David is capable of faking emotions. It's interesting that very few commentators suggest there's anything but authentic anger on David's part here, but we don't know that. So kindle against the man, and of course the great ambiguity with the man is central to the whole story. He said to Nathan, as Yahweh lives, recalling 4:9, we can go back to that right now and see, as Yahweh lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, as he used it positively there. I note that below it's a totally Deuteronomistic phrase. It's 35 times in the Masoretic text. All but one are in Deuteronomistic history or Jeremiah, which is closely associated. Some scholars would even suggest Jeremiah or one like him is the author of the entire Deuteronomistic history. It's only in Hosea as a negative elsewhere, apart from the Deuteronomistic history. So as Yahweh lives is a key phrase in the whole story here, and he uses that to set up this. The man who has done this, and the issue is what the this is, I'll come back to that in a second, is literally a son of death. And the this, as we can tell in Nathan's telling, is the theft. There's no adultery or murder in the story. The fact that the ewe lamb is taken, it will be eaten, but that's not told in the story. And of course, if the ewe lamb corresponds to Uriah here and is killed, then there's a charge against that. But that's not what he says in his response in verse 6. He's suggesting the lamb is still alive, not that it's been killed. And so he's seeing it simply as theft. And theft would not call for the death penalty. And many scholars have wondered about that there. Is son of death literally mean that he's to die to get the death penalty, or is it simply a figure of speech? It's hard to answer that here. And as my note below has in verse 6, David's judgment is twofold, on the theft and on the absence of pity or compassion. Let's look at that in some detail. And again, I'll put the key words back up so we can see how that plays in. He shall restore the lamb, using shalom here, only it'll be used again in 15:7. Let's look at that too. Here we see it as Absalom to pay back the vow, and that's the sense of restore there, to pay back the vow. The idea of repaying fourfold, if you're a New Testament reader, you'd recognize that as what Zacchaeus offers in response to Jesus, Zacchaeus, the tax collector. But it also echoes from Exodus 22:1. We can see here when someone steals an ox or a sheep. But as we've been noting, we can't assume that David knows about Exodus. There's no reference to it in the story. There are occasional references to Yahweh as the one who drew people out of Egypt. But as I've noted in my book, Come Out My People, the Exodus story is almost certainly written in response to the succession narrative in justifying why the rebellion of Jeroboam is not blasphemy and evil, as the southern writers from the Jerusalem perspective constantly write about the kings of Israel who continue the so-called sin of Jeroboam. So it does echo Exodus, but whether David is intending to echo that or readers are supposed to hear that isn't clear. But then we hear something very interesting. The word for because here is not the usual Hebrew ki, as you see below, but ekev, Jacob. It's a very unusual. It's only here and in verse 10 and in Deuteronomy in the entire Hebrew Bible. So it's interesting that Jacob is there, and we'll see here is Joseph. Added here, add is Joseph, as Rachel declared when God gave her Joseph, that have added a child. And so Jacob and Joseph are both here, and as I've noted in my Genesis series and also throughout, there are certainly many parallels between Jacob's journey and David's journey, as well as many parallels between the David and Joseph story. So I doubt that those are unintentional, the authors using language that would leave a little joke for the audience and they'd recognize it. And because he had no pity, using the word that we saw, that we see here, but was in the parable up here, that he had pity for the rich man had pity for his own sheep, but implicitly did not for the poor man's one ewe lamb. So with David's angry indignation, then we hear Nathan's response. And we hear here, Nathan said to David, and as Falkman notes, it's a messenger formula. We see it 2 other times, and all the 3 situations are linked. I won't show those all now, but when we get to them, both involving Absalom, we'll see how those are connected. You are the man. and a lot of notes to be paying attention to down here. We don't need to look at all these because that just underscores what I put into the chart. But let's listen to, and this is the note we don't need to listen to too that I put on the chart that you see here from Polson right at the beginning. So we don't need to look at that note right now. But here the interesting point is each of the characters has been referred to as a man in verse 4, of course not the ewe lamb. Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, an ambiguous reference given the struggle with Saul and the collapse of the Israel-Judah alliance later. We see God of Israel 21 times in the books of Samuel, but here the last one was in chapter 7 when Nathan again was predicting that David and his descendants would rule over Israel and Jerusalem forever, and then near the very end in 23:3. So the God of Israel will not be called on after this until all the way near the end of the book. And it's interesting that it's Israel here and not Judah. Notice that Israel is 3 times in these few verses here. And again, if I put up the key words, we can put that, see that there. I'll toggle back and forth. We see Israel, Israel, and Israel here, and then we'll see it chiastically down here with all Israel. I anointed you. Now, of course, literally Yahweh didn't anoint, but we saw it in 1 Samuel 16 when Samuel anointed on Yahweh's behalf. We see a number of other times where the people anoint David, but that's not Yahweh doing it there. And the I is the first person pronoun here, Anoki, only here in this speech. We've seen that Bathsheba used that when she said, I am pregnant, so this is the next use of it. It's rare from a normal human and not from Yahweh. But the first person verb forms are 5 times here. This is the only time it says has the pronoun, though. So I anointed you king over Israel. I rescued from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. The God who gives, and yet let's look more closely. I rescued you from the hand of Saul, or literally saved you, and that's the first time in 2 Samuel. Let's look at how that important word plays out here. We see it here in 2 Samuel a number of times, translated in a variety of ways as rescued or delivered, as saved. I color-coded this, as you can see at the top. The purple ones are where Yahweh is rescuing, delivering, or saving, and the green ones are where humans are. And I won't go through all those. You can see that all there. Notice that's one of 2 words used for saving or rescuing in the books of Samuel. We also see Yesh here, from which we get Yeshua, whether that's Joshua, the one who's Moses' companion, or Jesus in the New Testament as Yeshua. So using that word for help or salvation as well. And we see that in 2 Samuel in our context here back in chapter 10, and then we'll see it in chapter 14. But this is the one we have here. So I rescued you from the hand of Saul, recalling that from the past. And then this part is very interesting. As Polson notes what I was suggesting earlier, that in this case, God plays the rich man. I gave you into your master's house. As Jansen argues that the punishment here is for taking Bathsheba. And I want to notice that that's one view, and there's another view that we'll see. He says, what is at stake here is neither murder nor adultery, but who has the right to take and give to David? David has taken Bathsheba as the rich man took the lamb. In doing so, he has usurped God's role, and in this way has despised God. And yet we'll see verse 9 here where it specifies something else. So he gave you your master's or your Lord's house. Which house is that? Is that the house of Israel? Or is it the building? David built the house of cedar, so there wasn't a physical house. Does it mean his family, of all of Saul's family? But here it has his master's women as separate. So who could that be? Does it mean Jonathan, who's now dead, who died in battle with Saul? We don't know. And your master's women, and wives really is a bad translation here, because besides the fact that I've been noting throughout all my Hebrew Bible series here on Radical Bible, there is no word for wife in Hebrew. It's simply Isha, woman. And by making it wives, it suggests it's only the wives, whereas women, it can also be the daughters. And that's what we see in the chart here, that it's not just a Hinuam, it's also Mishal. So we can see that there. Into your bosom, a very intimate word. We saw that in verse 3 in the parable, where the lamb was in the rich man's bosom, which is very odd there. And we, according to that, now we see the master's wife. This would be a Hinuam in your bosom. Of course, that's not, this is what God is giving, not what has been taken. And I gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. So now we hear Judah in contrast with the God of Israel and all Israel later. We hear the house of Israel and all of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. What more could have been added? I noted just a minute ago that was the Joseph part. And so, in addition to that, now we get the rhetorical question from Yahweh. Why have you despised the word of Yahweh to do what is evil in his eyes, or in his sight? Double there for emphasis. And I note here, with that image coming out live in the story, before the very sun, if you will, it's echoing what we only heard from the narrator in 11:27, that what David had done was evil in Yahweh's eyes. So now it's named out loud. As Rochelle Gilmore argues, quote, Nathan's framing of the transgression as being against God, not against Uriah or Bathsheba, keeps the event in the incontestable power realm of David's relationship with Yahweh, and works to reinforce David's monarchy after the Absalom revolt. And that's one of her arguments that these chapters were put in here, ironically, from our perspective, to reinforce David's monarchy. Because what happens here is God lets go or overlooks the sin, as we will, as we'll note in a minute, and David continues to be king, and the promise in 2 Samuel 7 is not vitiated. And so what it's suggesting is David could stumble here, but he doesn't fall, and the promise in 2 Samuel 7 is continued. We'll have to continue farther to see that. You have struck down Uriah with the sword. And notice the little ABA chiasm that my note has here. Struck down Uriah with the sword, taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword. Obviously telling us something that we just heard. Notice it has both sides of it. He is named here as Uriah the Hittite, and the sword of the Ammonites is named there. And so plainly, in the word of Yahweh, Nathan discovers the whole story. We hadn't known whether he knew that before, but apparently Yahweh told us to him, or he knew it and it's being reinforced. We can't know if he didn't already know that somehow. So struck down Uriah with a sword couldn't be made more clear. There's no ambiguity here of the killing and the taking. And now we turn to the therefore, and that's where we shift to this version of it as going to be here. This is still the preface for the punishment version. Therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me. Notice, not just despised my word, but despised me. Despising Yahweh only this other time. Let's listen to that one here. Therefore, Yahweh, the God of Israel, declared, I promise that your family and the family of your ancestors should go in and out before me forever. But now Yahweh declares, far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be treated with contempt. That to the house of Eli. And so we see it happened there, and now it's suggested it would happen here. But of course, the outcome will not be exactly the same as it was for Eli, who fell down and died, and his children didn't follow in his ways and ended up dead. It's not quite as simple for David. And taken the woman of Uriah to be your woman. And so now we get to the punishment element here. Thus says Yahweh. And as fuel and gun note, what is Yahweh's response to the rich man David? It is to behave as the rich man. And I will note here that he'll take your wives from before your eyes, just as he took Saul's wife and gave it to David. Makes me think of the Grateful Dead song, New Minglewood Blues, where the singer sings his primary occupation is stealing women from their men. And that seems to be Yahweh's role here, to steal women from their men. Now, if you're worried about what that means about God, I just want to note this isn't saying something from our perspective about who God really is. This is a character in a religion of empire story where God acts in what we might call a certain kind of karma to repay David exactly how he's being repaid, which is to say, not an eye for an eye, but a taken woman for a taken woman. And we know from the New Testament and the text that Jesus cites throughout, that I call the religion of creation text, that this is only one way to characterize God. There are many other ways to characterize God. So this is not making a statement that I'm claiming is a truth about Yahweh, that if you do something, Yahweh will do it right back to you. This is part of the story that's being told for a particular purpose. And that purpose is not to establish some objective description of who Yahweh is and how Yahweh acts. So thus says Yahweh, I will raise up trouble against you. Omitting a hina here, I will raise up evil against you. It's not trouble as it was earlier, not trouble. It's the same evil that he just accused David of doing. And that's another aspect that we would not suggest happens, that God brings evil. Although we saw in 1 Samuel that God sent an evil spirit on Saul. So it's consistent with what we've seen there. So you spread evil, David, and I'll spread evil on you. From within your own house, I will act like a king. I will take your women from before your eyes. Notice all the elements of eyes and foresight. And give them, interestingly, to your neighbor, which is a play on evil here. Neighbor is Ra, and this is Ria, and it also has the connotation of inferior or ugly or disagreeable or unwholesome, much like evil. It's not suggesting that Absalom is evil, but it's just a play on that there. And he, certainly this is meant to imply Absalom, although we don't know it in the story yet, but we as readers will certainly know it. He shall lie, just as David did with Bathsheba, with your women, in the sight of this very sun, or literally in the eyes of this very sun, which I translated consistently over here, as you can see. Clearly, the New RC translators are a little concerned about the eyes of the sun, but it's plainly a metaphor. Let's just work with the metaphor here. As Von Walde notes below, this is the only time in the entire Masoretic text where the eyes of applies to a non-person. And then this very odd phrase, this very sun here. And this is where she wrote an article, Von Walde wrote an article that really gets into great details about this. And I've summarized just the essence of her point here. She notes that the word shemesh for sun is normally masculine, but here it's feminine, as it is 16 times in the Masoretic text. But in verse 12, it isn't clearly gendered when it repeats here. This one is gendered female, and this one is not. But she notes the imagery of the solar disk with wings was common all around the ancient Near East, often supporting kings and representing justice, as it did in Egypt. And she says, quote, this sun can be understood to represent the incorruptible judge whose rays from zenith to horizon penetrate and discover injustice done to victims. And you can see that plays out in the Israelite context from this archaeological element from the so-called Megiddo ivory, which shows a similar scene in an Israelite context of the sun there seeming to provide its imprimatur over the king there. So whether it's looking on with justice or the very fact that in broad daylight everybody can see what's happening, that's what's being said here. And it's repeated for emphasis here. For you did it secretly, although curiously, as we've been noting, the secretly that normally happens when politicians establish conspiracy to assassinate people is in the official document here in the book of Samuel. So it's not secretly from any reader who ever learned of the story. There's no secret annal somewhere. It's right here. But David, as a character of the story, thinks it secretly. But I, Yahweh, will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. And we'll see how David responds to this threefold indictment next time. See you then for that.